Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is easily one of the most fascinating legal paradoxes to ever land in front of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. We are looking at the landmark 1998 case of Osman versus the Attorney General. It's a case that's going to pull us deep into the mechanics of our justice system, force us to confront the shadows of the country's history, and present a constitutional riddle that, at first glance, seems totally impossible to solve.
Now consider this for a second. Does explaining yourself actually violate your right to silence? I mean, it sounds like a complete riddle, right? If the highest law in the land says you have a fundamental, constitutional right to remain silent and be presumed innocent, how can a law also turn around and punish you for failing to give an explanation? Are these two ideas just doomed to crash into each other over and over, or is there a way to actually harmonize them in the real world? Well, that is exactly the catch-22 we are going to untangle together today.
Okay, let's quickly look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the stolen tires case, move on to a clash of rights, explore the history of forced confessions, unpack the burden of proof, and finally, look at the final verdict.
Section 1. The stolen tires case.
Let's set the scene with the facts on the ground. The story kicks off in August 1993 in the Northwest Province, specifically down in the regional court at Rustenburg. Musa Osman and Mohammed Shiraz Osman found themselves in some very serious legal trouble. You see, they were allegedly found in possession of tires, and these weren't just any random tires. There was a very reasonable suspicion that they had been stolen. Because of this, they were charged under Section 36 of the General Law Amendment Act 62 of 1955. Now, this specific piece of legislation has three very strict elements that the state absolutely has to prove. First, the accused must actually be found in physical possession of the goods. Second, a suspicion founded on reasonable grounds must exist that those goods were stolen. And third, and this is the absolute crux of the issue we'll be focusing on today, there must be an inability on the part of the person to give a satisfactory account of that possession. If the state proves all three of these elements, you're guilty of an offense, and you face the exact same penalties as a conviction for theft.
Section 2. A clash of rights.
Right at the very start of their trial in the regional court, the Osman's defense team threw up a massive legal roadblock. They didn't just argue about the tires themselves, no. They argued about the very fabric of the law that was being used against them. And this brings us to a huge constitutional conflict. Think about it. Under Section 36, you essentially must give a satisfactory account of why you have these suspicious goods to avoid a conviction. But under Section 25 of the Constitution, specifically Sections 25(2)c and 25(3)c, arrested persons are explicitly protected from being compelled to make a confession. You are guaranteed the absolute right to a fair trial, which includes being presumed innocent and remaining completely silent during plea proceedings and the trial itself. So the defense posed a rather brilliant question here. How can a law pressure you to explain yourself literally under the threat of conviction if the Constitution guarantees your absolute right to silence? Doesn't Section 36 effectively force you to testify against yourself?
Before we get into how the court actually answered that massive question, we need to quickly clear up a weird little timeline quirk. You might be wondering why the court used the interim Constitution of 1993 to judge this case, especially since the court delivered this judgment in September 1998, which was well after the final 1996 Constitution came into force. Well, the alleged crime happened in August 1993, and the Osmans were summoned in August 1994. The rule of law basically states that proceedings pending before a court when the new Constitution took effect must be disposed of as if the new Constitution had not been enacted, unless the interests of justice require otherwise. The court took a look at this and decided there was absolutely no reason the new Constitution should displace the old one here, so the interim Constitution was the strict yardstick used for this specific ruling.
Section 3. The history of forced confessions.
Now, to truly understand why the defense's argument carried so much weight, and frankly why the Constitutional Court took this challenge so incredibly seriously, we have to look back at South Africa's painful historical context. The right to silence isn't just some dry, abstract legal technicality. It is fiercely protected for a very dark reason. During the apartheid era, the fundamental rights of countless citizens were systematically violated. The rights of arrested persons were progressively eroded, basically to the point of non-existence. Police interrogations were frequently accompanied by extreme physical brutality. Arrested persons were routinely thrown into solitary confinement, completely cut off from the outside world, their lawyers, and their families. The state often leaned heavily on these inhuman methods to extract confessions, completely bypassing the hard, independent investigative work actually required to prove a case.
Justice Madala, who actually wrote the judgment for this case, captured this painful history perfectly. He wrote, "The right was honored more in the breach than in its observance." He noted that courts historically found themselves dealing with an ever-increasing number of cases where coerced confessions were just the everyday reality. Because of this incredibly dark history, South African courts today are hypersensitive to any law or any police tactic that might even remotely resemble unacceptable methods of extracting a confession. The core principle that the state must always prove its case without forcing the accused to basically hand them the evidence on a silver platter is absolutely foundational to the modern legal system.
Section 4. Unpacking the burden of proof.
So, keeping all of that heavy history in mind, how on earth did the Constitutional Court untangle this knot? How did they manage to respect the right to silence without making it practically impossible to prosecute people found with suspected stolen goods? Well, it all relies on understanding a legal concept called a prima facie case. In our adversarial legal system, the burden of proof rests squarely and permanently on the state. There is absolutely no onus on the accused to disprove anything initially. The state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. However, once the prosecution presents enough evidence to establish a prima facie case, which basically means they've successfully proved the essential elements of the crime with credible evidence, the entire dynamic shifts. The ball moves directly into the accused's court. If the accused then fails to produce evidence to rebut that strong case, well, they put themselves at a very serious risk of conviction.
And this brings us to a remarkably crucial distinction made by the court regarding Section 36. The crime here is the inability to explain, not the unwillingness to explain. The court pointed out that the actual timing of your explanation is kind of a minor detail. An accused person can provide a satisfactory account at any time prior to the trial, or they could even wait until they are literally in the courtroom during the trial itself. As long as the account is given to the satisfaction of the court at some point, the accused is completely entitled to an acquittal. The state still carries the heavy burden of proving that you are genuinely unable to explain it. That remains a core element of the offense that the prosecution must demonstrate.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Justice Madala brilliantly dismantled the defense's argument by drawing a line between legal compulsion and practical choice. You see, Section 36 imposes absolutely no legal compulsion to speak. You are not forced by the law under threat of punishment for your silence to say a single word to the police or to the judge. You can choose to remain completely silent from the exact moment of your arrest through the entire trial. However, if the state proves you had the goods and they prove a reasonable suspicion that they were stolen, they have built a very strong prima facie case against you. At that exact moment, you face a practical choice. You might find it incredibly wise to furnish a defense. That could mean testifying yourself, it could mean calling other witnesses to speak on your behalf, or it could just mean pointing out technical defects in the prosecution's case. The choice remains entirely yours. The law doesn't force you to speak. The overwhelming strength of the evidence against you simply makes it a practical necessity if you want to avoid a guilty verdict.
Section 5. The final verdict.
So with the burden of proof clarified and that vital distinction between legal compulsion and practical reality firmly established, we arrive at the ultimate resolution. The final verdict is in. Section 36 is indeed constitutional, and the appeal was completely dismissed. Justice Madala concluded that requiring an explanation for possessing suspected stolen goods does not violate the presumption of innocence, and it certainly doesn't violate the right to silence. At no point does the actual legal burden of proof shift to the accused, and at no point is the accused legally forced to testify against themselves. The court rightly realized that if the right to silence meant you never had to rebut a strong, evidence-based case built by the state, it would quite literally destroy the fundamental nature of the adversarial justice system entirely.
Before we officially wrap up, I've got a surprisingly interesting procedural fact for you about this historic judgment. This case was originally argued before 10 judges of the Constitutional Court. However, during the lengthy preparation of the judgment, Justice Didcot unfortunately fell ill and couldn't participate in the final deliberations. Now, this could have been a major crisis, because previous case law dictated that a court must have a full quorum to deliver a judgment. But, under Section 167 of the final Constitution, a matter must be heard by at least 8 judges. Because there were exactly 9 judges remaining who were able to finalize the decision, they legally satisfied the minimum quorum, allowing this landmark ruling to be validly passed and entered into history.
And that brings us to the end of today's Explainer. I want to leave you with this provocative final thought. When the state builds a rock-solid case against you, is your silence a constitutional shield, or is it really just a calculated risk? The Osman case brilliantly shows us that while the Constitution absolutely protects you from being forced to speak, it certainly does not protect you from the consequences of staying quiet when the evidence is stacked incredibly high against you. It's a truly fascinating balance between protecting human rights from historical abuse and ensuring our justice system can still function effectively to hold individuals accountable. I hope this structured look at the case helped clarify exactly how the Constitutional Court navigated this complex catch-22. Keep questioning the law and keep learning.